This is Chapter 5, Intersections, from Gender, Ideas, Interactions, Institutions, 2nd edition. Okay, so gender isn't something we are, but something we do. In short, it's a performance. It's an interpretation or an expression of an internalized sense of a gender identity. So gender is variable. Gender has fluidity. It's not inherent. It is through our social interactions that gender takes on its own life. So we're going to discuss doing gender, more in depth as we did in Chapter 4, but just to reiterate that, gender isn't something that we just identify as, it's also something we do. And, it's an aspect of how others see us and treat us. So the number one gender rule is that we must do gender. Whether we conform or transgress, it's expected that we perform gender, and it makes a lot of people uncomfortable if you don't perform gender. So it comes with social sanctions if you don't engage in the performance. So most people take the path of least resistance and perform in a narrow definition of what they're socially allowed to be, while other people bravely give zero fucks and are who they are in a more authentic way. So gender is not all that we are. We also have many other social locations, such as age, sexuality, race, ethnicity, social class, physical ability, immigration status or nationality, and many, many more, right? And all of these intersect with another, meaning they overlap and they affect how meanings are distributed, how power and privilege is distributed, and we're going to kind of go through some of those examples. So, gender is not an isolated fact. Obviously, in a course like this, it's important to look at gender as its own social phenomenon and the way that it affects society. But of course, we don't exist in a vacuum, right? It's not that we are our gender one day, our social class the next day, our race, ethnicity the next day. We're all of those things at the same time, right? So gender is not an isolated fact. It's actually one fact about us that intersects with all the other social locations that make up our identity. Intersectionality is a theory that acknowledges that people are often disadvantaged by various social locations, which can result in inequality or oppression. So you might not just be disadvantaged by gender, right? We have social hierarchies that give more power and status to people at the top, right? So if the top of our gender hierarchy in society is men or cisgendered men with, biologically assigned at birth men, then we have stratified every other representation of gender below that, right? So of course, cisgendered women, then people who are trans or non-binary. So there's a kind of a rigid hierarchy. But when you look at all the other social locations, they have the same thing, right? So social class is the easiest example of this because it literally ranks itself, right? You have the upper class, the middle class, the lower class, right? This idea that some are above and they have more, and they can do much more in society with what they have. So if you think about money, it's not just about money, it's about power, right? Wealth gives this opportunity to attain more power, to affect what laws are created, all these kind of things we'll discuss later. But just thinking about it, social class as a hierarchy, we have to understand that, men and women as a group, they're not monolithic groups, right? These are also social definitions. So to be a poor woman and a rich woman are very different experiences, the intersections of that, right? So you can still have the commonality of some female experience in some regards, but of course your individual experiences are going to vary based on that social class. And then add race in there, right? How much does that then affect the way that people are treated, right? So even though we know that, people that are poor face a lot more marginality, we also know that racism is a very strong and prevalent force in our society. So people of color that are poor are going to face additional marginalities, additional problems, right? So again, intersectionality just makes us realize that all of these interactions, these overlapping social, locations, this is how we actually kind of result in our individual experiences. And if we ignore the intersections, we ignore the people that are at the lower ends of any of these social hierarchies, then that we ourselves become complicit in the inequality and oppression that comes from those systems, right? So identity markers are connected. And that's kind of like an important point to take away from this chapter. So intersectionality recognizes that, to be female, right, and to be Black, these are connected and they result in different responses from either, right, in the way that they intersect. So it's interesting, like when we talk about high-profile police killings, we often focus on men, right, when there's so many women that are also murdered by the police. So I put something in this lecture to kind of address that as well, but just to talk about how different intersections of identities affect our awareness and our kind of social understandings of different issues. Okay, so gender inflects us. So it means that's going to affect all the other things about us, right? So what does that mean about the role of gender in our lives? It means that gender constrains or dictates our other social identities. For example, gender affects the way we age. Because women are often understood as sex objects in our culture, their social value falls after they're not reproductively capable, which is why you see women disappear from the A-list once they hit their 40s. Though some people are staying impossibly young to stay in that game, right? Like a Jennifer Aniston. I'm telling you, when I was a kid, no one who was 50 looked that good, right? Or Paul Rudd, who hasn't aged in 30 years. It's kind of insane. But why do they stay so young looking? Because we equate sexuality with youth. And we see women differently as they age than how we see men as they age. For some men, they can become distinguished with age, or we see it as normal, when they have gray hair or wrinkles, right? We also normalize when a man dates a woman who's 20 or 30 years younger than him, right? There's still this kind of sexual virility given to men as they age. But for women, we see this differently. The gender dynamics are very different, right? So gender affects us in all of these intersections. Another thing that gender does is it affects our health, our life expectancy, sometimes due to the traditional gender role differences that result in consequences, such as not wanting to ask for help, right? This used to be a big trope. Oh, men would never stop and ask for directions, right? But again, this becomes much more serious as an issue of not seeking help when it comes to not seeking mental health help, right? So not going to a therapist. So we know that more men end up killing themselves, especially with guns, as they're stigmatized more than women for seeking help. And again, it can also be as simple as just not going to the doctor. I remember this example where my dad threw out his shoulder once, like he couldn't even lift his hand to his mouth to brush his teeth, but he had this very I'll just walk it off, it'll be fine kind of mentality, and just suffered like that for days until my mom basically forced him to get a doctor's appointment, called on his behalf, made an appointment for him. And then, of course, when he went in and got his shoulder addressed, he was better. But it was this kind of just knee-jerk reaction he had to say, no, it's not a big deal. I can handle it. I can handle pain. Right? And sometimes these things are very gendered, especially when you're paying for health insurance, you should probably use it, right? But again, this is just an interesting fact that's not just my dad. There's a interesting phenomenon where heterosexual men who are married live longer than unmarried heterosexual men. While for heterosexual women, there's no difference in getting married, right? In your life expectancy. So anyway, another example could be of the intersections would be how physical ability is gendered, which we'll talk about in a minute, right? There's different treatment, expectations, and really representations for men and women. So the chapter discusses this, but again, if we equate masculinity with physical ability, and that ability is diminished, then it can affect our gender perceptions of individuals. The same goes with beauty standards, ignoring women who are disabled or seeing them as non-sexual. And again, social class, economic inequality, these are also gendered and of course raced. So who we think is suited for what job, who we think is a success, who's capable, who's a leader. All of these things are very gendered for us. So, who's the boss, who's the subordinate? Often this mirrors our larger social arrangements. So we know that women and people of color work in many industries with hazardous conditions, substandard pay, and no benefits such as health coverage or retirement plans. For example, when you look at domestic laborers and farm workers, both of which can be any gender, but there are specific intersectional hardships at play. Both social class, gender, and ethnicity intersect because they're facing marginalization on multiple levels, such as without being documented, many workers lack protections or abilities to affect the exploitive conditions that they face. So the crew leader at the farm can just decide to pay you half of what was promised, and there's very little that workers can do about this. The crew leader can charge farm workers for the ride to the farm, charge them for a drink of water when they're laboring in the hot sun, right? So we all have food to eat as a result of their hard work. So this exploitive environment where the power dynamic is so unequal can also lead to further harassment, even sexual harassment and assault. As sometimes women are raped while working for these farms, but as they're not documented, they face marginalization when reporting to police. As women, they're blamed or suspected when they report a case of sexual assault, as all women are. And the person who owns the farm often has enough money or influence to make sure that the charges go nowhere. So for instance, one woman, Marilyn Perez, told her story to journalists of working on farms where she had her pay withheld and was sexually harassed and groped. And when she told him to stop, he threatened to have her deported. And when he escalated, she pushed back and threatened, and he ended up threatening her with a gun. So she knew her family was depending on the money that she was sending home, right, of $35 that she would make each day. So when she threatened to quit, because of the harassment, her life was also threatened. So she felt like there was really nothing she could do about it, right? So in research about 10 years ago with women in California's Central Valley, 80% experienced sexual harassment. So clearly this is a larger issue. But I just wanted to use these couple examples to show how intersections matter. As we look at someone's identity, we look at multiple categories, not just gender, but ethnicity, immigration status, social class, and we see how those categories and conditions are connected. How if you had a lot of privileged social identities, you also had probably a very privileged experience of life. And the opposite is also true. If you face multiple intersecting identities that are marginalized by the hegemony of our society, then you face boundaries on top of boundaries, hurdles on top of hurdles. So it's not enough to look at each identity alone, because socially they're connected in our meanings, right? And then there's this idea of being unmarked. So unmarked is something we often call hegemony, right? The dominant power system. But what it means to be unmarked is that the social identity is assumed for a role or context without qualification. So think about the dominant groups, the hegemonic groups in society are often unmarked. So when we talk about gender, we talk about women, we don't talk about men as if they don't have a gender, right? When we talk about race, we talk about people of color, but we don't talk about white people as if they don't have a race ethnicity, right? So it's the way that when those groups remain invisible, they kind of retain their power because people can't even mentally see them as anything but the default category in society. So gender strategies, it's just the reality that we each find a way of doing gender that works for us. So the gender strategy we choose to employ can change according to the situation that we're in and of course the players that we're interacting with. So some of the examples from the book were the girly girl gender strategy, right? The tomboy gender strategy, the jock, right? The dork, the nerd. So again, these are often kind of tropes as well. But again, there are kind of social definitions that encapsulate these particular kinds of identities that people often fall into as they're young adults and trying to find themselves in their identities. So when it comes to gender designations and strategies, we all use strategies for success, and it really depends on what success is to us and the kind of specific conditions of our lives that we find ourselves in. So some of the examples in the book based on social class would be like the breadwinner gender strategy, right? The idea that you would be the financial provider for the home, right? The wonderful wife and mother strategy that is kind of the counter, that you're that your focus and your identity focus is on being a good wife and mother. A career woman where your gender strategy is that of someone who has ambition and wants to have success within their career, right? The super mom, who often is characterized in such a way because there's so much work to do, and somehow she gets it done. And that really does make her almost like a superhero, because it's crazy hard to raise children these days, especially because we live in a society that does not offer the same kind of opportunities and really protections and programs that other cultures do that are very similar to our own, right? Especially other similar income countries offer paid family leave, often have childcare that's affordable and often available at your workplace, right? Things that would be revolutionary if done here that are considered completely normal in the rest of the world for decades, right? But here you're like a weird commie if you're say, hey, maybe a couple weeks after you give birth, you don't have to go right back to work without being paid, right? So the supermom strategy might be employed by somebody that feels that they have to provide this kind of gendered strategy because they don't feel like they could fit into the other gendered strategies like career woman. Super dad's another one of those where maybe a super dad might be someone who kind of, again, fulfills that role of being a great parent, but they might choose that role because of a lack of other economic opportunities, right? So we have to think about how the gender strategies we employ have a lot to do with our lack of other opportunities, such as being a blue collar guy, right? As they talked about in the book, you know, a lot of people that are super about their identity as being blue collar would probably not be that way if they won the lottery, right? The idea being that if you have, you know, more wealth in a social class understanding, then you have more flexibility in what gender strategies you employ. But when you're poor, that can often limit the kind of gender strategies. So again, we're going to talk about this in a second here with economic class. So our life chances are affected by where we grow up, obviously, right? The kind of social area that we live in really does affect us. And of course, the resources of that area and, you know, how much our family has access to those resources is what really affects us, because it's not just your own family, it's also the community in which you grow up. So when it comes to class status and gender strategies, economic class and place of residence intersect with gender, right? And so like I was saying, this just means that some gender strategies are available to rich people that are not available to poor people. So the more money you have, the more strategies that are available. And some identities bring us privilege, right? And privilege is just that unearned social and economic advantage that is based on our social location within a hierarchy. But other identities don't, right? So maybe you're a member of the working class and you have some privileges in other identities, but not as your social class. So, you know, that means it's going to affect, specifically in the context of this class, your gender strategies that you choose to employ. Okay, moving on to race and gender. In our culture, we have a very white supremacist ideology in our culture that's embedded within the culture, largely because of the kind of ongoing racial projects. So when I say racial projects, I mean the kind of Omi and Wanant definition of racial projects, or what they call racial formation, which is basically the process of how racial identities are created, lived through, transformed, and then of course destroyed. So basically they see the role of race as embedded within all of the US institutions, and so of course that has a very strong driving force in how our society then treats people based on race and ethnicity, right? So we're going to talk much more about that later on, but just in case you haven't heard of racial formation theory or any of that, and I'm just throwing random terms at you, right? So anyway, because of the kind of white supremacy within our culture, this really impacts how people's bodies are treated. And so in our culture, some bodies matter more than others. And so race is a huge designation in the way that we place value or remove value from people's bodies. And again, you can't disconnect this from the long racial history of the United States, which has everything to do with literally defining people as not people, or 3/5 a person, or any of these kind of things. It's a trajectory from that time period that still informs the way that we have very structured racial separations today and inequality today, right? So as we talk about, structural racism. So anyway, Race is, again, just another way that we intersect with gender, and this affects the kind of social definitions and opportunities that we have. So there are, some racial groups that are denigrated, while others have advantages in society because of the privilege of their skin, right? Obviously, in this case, white privilege. But all racial groups are subject to advantages and disadvantages just related to their unique histories. So when you look at first African American men and stereotypes of black men often assert that they're aggressive, prone to criminality, and sexually violent. So the labels are reflective of hypermasculinity, which means that blackness is supposed to somehow intensify masculinity, right? And this affects the way that people are treated in the culture because of these weird stereotypical assumptions. So behavior by white boys is seen as boys being boys, while, the same exact behavior by black boys is seen as malicious, devious, and dangerous. So although we acknowledge that race is a social construction, it has real impacts and consequences for anyone who's racialized in society. So for black men, this means that some of the stereotypes get applied to them, and that can affect how, people and organizations treat them and interact with them. And really, like for example, there's this research study that talks about how within the criminal justice system, it's problematic because our perceptions of age are affected by race ethnicity. So basically, when you're like sitting on a jury and you see a 14-year-old, people tend to think a white 14-year-old male is a couple years younger than he is, but they tend to think a white or a black 14-year-old male is a few years older than he is, right? And the same thing with a Latino teenage male, right? So what's the problem with that? Well, we have legal thresholds based on your kind of culpability in a crime, right? So the younger you are, the more we kind of excuse away some behavior because we just feel like, well, they're not as sophisticated, they make mistakes, etc. But when it comes to something like, if you think that the same, right, like whatever the crime is that's been committed, if you think that the person that's on trial for this is 12, you're going to have a different perspective of their kind of culpability of the crime, of how much they planned it out, how responsible they are, than if you think that same 14-year-old, but because they're black, you think they're 17, right? Or because they're Latino, you think they're 16 or 17. That's going to affect then your likelihood of even just seeing them as more criminals. So that's just one example, but there's hundreds of these examples, right? There's research in the book that talks from sociologist Ann Ferguson talking about how teachers of all races tend to view black boys' misbehavior more harshly than white boys that do the exact same thing. So even if people themselves are people of color, we are all affected by the social stereotypes, by the narratives and the stigma that kind of permeates a lot of our socialization and our social interactions. So Ann Ferguson believed that black boys who wanted to be seen as good had to use docility as a racialized survival strategy. So basically to be sweet and kind and gentle, to try and go against this assumption that somehow they're inherently aggressive. So this gentle black man gender and racial strategy is then used to avoid being stereotyped as dangerous, right, just for existing. So the gentle black man persona may help a black man to avoid being stopped by police or hassled and followed in a retail store, but in other ways, it's not going to affect the larger structural problem of, the knee-jerk reaction of society to see people, well, specifically African-American men, as somehow criminal and dangerous. So again, if you take my crim class, we can talk about Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow that goes into an analysis of how, the kind of racial caste systems throughout time, where she argues that bodies are defined by the racial caste system. So the first racial caste system being slavery, right, where people were basically, if they were black, they were defined as property, right? And then the second racial caste system in America was Jim Crow segregation. And during Jim Crow segregation, to be black was to be a second-class citizen, right? And so now we're in this more modern era. We have our third racial caste system, which is mass incarceration. So in today's racial ideology, to be black, especially a black male, is to be criminal. So we kind of have social definitions that then get defined on individual bodies, and this is incredibly problematic, and it affects all sorts of negative consequences on society. So when it comes to African American women and stereotypes, Black women are also stereotyped, but in different ways than Black men, right? So this is where we see that intersection. So Black women are stereotyped as being less feminine than white women, as being hypersexual, and as being more physically tough than white women. So the stereotype of the strong Black woman may seem to be complimentary, but it's actually a denial of Black women's vulnerability, of their femininity, and their need for actual help and support. So meaning if people expect that you can handle more, then they put more on your shoulders, and they don't have as much sympathy and support for you when you need help. And so that's a big problem of this. It's not to say that someone shouldn't be strong. Of course, many, that's a good quality of anyone to have, regardless of gender. But the idea is that if we pretend as if every Black woman is some sort of, unfeeling super being, right, that could just deal with all of the slights and stigma and consequences of the kind of racist society that we live in without a need for help or support, I mean, that's our problem for, again, caricaturizing or stereotyping an entire group of people. So to counter stereotypes and those accompanying risks, many Black women try to overcompensate by doing more femininity than they would otherwise so that they won't come up against some of these stereotypes. So more important than the specific stereotypes themselves is the connection of social narratives to the history of colonization, slavery, and this forced second-class status. Okay, so doing femininity. In our culture, because all of these social definitions intersect, femininity is seen as implicitly white, which is why doing femininity can feel like doing whiteness, right? Like straightening your hair. It can feel like performing a certain kind of whiteness. And in not just like on a kind of day-to-day basis or in a trivial way, I mean, this really affects like who gets jobs and who doesn't. Like all sorts of other things are affected. So some women are going to reject this whole kind of implicitly white femininity and embrace a Black as beautiful gender strategy. But at the same time, culturally there's often a consequence, a social consequence for not embracing an implicitly white femininity or trying to follow that femininity. So women are then considered unprofessional or less attractive or somehow aggressive or threatening. And these are like literal based on like what hairstyle they choose. Like things like that seem so benign that it should really not affect like what jobs you have or how much respect you're treated with. Because really you should just treat people with respect. It shouldn't really matter about like what their hairstyle is. But again, this just shows how, people have to employ certain gender strategies. And oftentimes with our gender strategies, if there's any transgression at all against the dominant groups in society, then we become somehow deviant, and those kind of consequences can come from that, right? And so that's why a lot of people adhere to conventional gender norms, because there's social consequences for not doing it, especially for Black women. When it comes to race and gender, Asian American men also face very specific stereotypes. So the early history of Chinese immigrants, which involved work on the railroad, often required performing labor against their will, has really affected our cultural imagination around Asian men in America and still has a lingering effect. So since the Chinese laboring immigrants were not able to bring their wives and female family members over while they were laboring, Chinese men ended up performing their own domestic work because there weren't any women around, right? The kind of quote-unquote women's work as we characterized it in society at the time. So this is what has feminized Asian men, right? We have this kind of weird cultural notion that somehow Asian men are more feminine than other men, and really it really kind of stems from the stereotypes that came about at a time period where their labor was also being exploited. So we often see not just intersections of gender and social class and race, right? So it's not just the two, it's three of these things. And so more of these intersections. Oftentimes there's multiple complicated intersections at play. right? So stereotypes about Asian Americans are closely related to the historical role within America's growth, right? When most Asians provided domestic service to whites. So again, seeing them as docile or more agreeing with white society, right? So even this kind of model minority stuff comes out of this idea that they're somehow adhering more to white culture norms, comes from history as laborers. Because Asian men are more feminized in our cultural imagination, this affects their choice of gender strategies. So some Asian men compensate by acting more aggressively, right? And that's, just a way to try to counter the stereotypes that are being placed upon them, right? When it comes to Asian American women and stereotypes, Asian women are feminized racially and fetishized sexually in our cultural imagination. So many Chinese and Japanese women were brought to the United States in the late 1800s as sex slaves. This history has been the foundation of the stereotype that Asian women are passive and sexually available, was the fact that women were trafficked here as sex slaves against their will. Somehow that is the formation of that stereotype, right? So we have to understand, oftentimes you have to look back to history, but critically and clearly to understand where do these things come from and why do we still believe this crap? Largely because it forms our interactions with each other and it makes its way into social institutions. So Asian women and men, just like, black men and women, face challenges because of the way gender stereotypes intersect with beliefs about their culture. So when it comes to white American men and women, white is the racial default in America, so whiteness is the unmarked racial category. Whiteness is seen as normal, and everyone else is defined as other and marked by race and ethnicity. However, this means that whiteness is also seen as boring, right? As less exciting. And so white Americans are what they're experiencing is just being unmarked. And being unmarked means that it's likely that others see white as the norm and anyone else is an outlier or a deviation from that norm. So that obviously affects gender strategies for white Americans. So some middle-class whites adopt the all-American girl or boy next door strategy, while others try to differentiate themselves from the mainstream. So working class poors and whites, so when you look at another intersection there of social class, working class poor whites may adopt gender strategies in response to the stigma of poverty, or to assert their identity in relationship to the culture of others with whom they identify. So white people do have some stigmatized identities, but they tend to be connected to social class. So for working class and poor whites, they adopt different strategies lacking financial privilege. They can't perform the strategies that the rich white people can. So some people kind of take to this urban white girl strategy, which can be kind of like when you're living in a neighborhood that's predominantly people of color, some, white girls will adopt this kind of honorary wannabe status. Because again, what they're doing is developing a gender identity and gendered strategy that is more connected to their daily lived experiences than some social definition of whiteness, right? While others go far to the other end to the white supremacist strategy of just being a hot pile of hateful garbage, right? It can be intoxicating for some people to hear that their mediocrity is just, or their subordinate position in society is really just someone else's fault. So Nazis and other white supremacists just blame immigrants, they blame communities of color, they blame homosexuals, right? They blame marginalized communities when really they're just largely the victims of globalization and capitalism as much as other poor communities. But they've been co-opted. It's the lure of whiteness, as Tim Wise says. And these identity labels like white trash, no one wants to be stereotyped and disrespected. So a persona like white trash is something we're not really in control of as a label if we receive it. So we often do our best to fend off stigmatizing identities and assert esteemed ones instead, to kind of control the way that we're interpreted in society. But often we can't do that, and these terms get put on us. Okay, when it comes to sexual orientation terms, so sexual minorities are just groups that are affected by the heteronormative expectations of our culture that assume that everybody's heterosexual, right? So these would be gays, lesbians, bisexuals, pansexuals, trans people, basically anyone that doesn't perform a very rigid expectation of sexuality or gender. So when it comes to homophobia, this is the bias against and fear of sexual minorities. And that differs a little bit from compulsory heterosexuality. So if homophobia is bias or fear, compulsory heterosexuality is just saying that somehow everybody is heterosexual. So if someone doesn't feel heterosexual, they have to hide their sexual orientation, right? That sexual attraction and relationships only happen between one man and one woman. And then that's normal, and anything else is deviant, right? That's what compulsory heterosexuality means. And that really informs a lot of our social holidays, our notions of family, all sorts of cultural definitions, right? So heteronormativity, again, the assumption that everyone's heterosexual unless there's signs that suggest otherwise. While homonormativity is a practice of obeying most gender rules except the desiring a partner of the opposite sex, right? So that's that would still be like getting married with your partner or kind of following more conventional gender presentations. So when it comes to global perspectives on lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, there are differing consequences around the world. So gender strategies that are not gender conforming have consequences depending on someone's sexual orientation, but also, again, your national location is another intersection. So being open and proud of one's sexuality are primarily considered healthy in America, while in France and other parts of Europe, it's seen as like no big deal. And declaring your sexuality is seen as being dramatic or rude, which is funny because, like, how could the French think other people are rude, right? But anyway, the idea being that culture is an important intersection in how we even understand some of our social identities, and these things vary even in the Western world from different society or culture to culture. So for instance, in many developing countries, same-sex relationships are unlabeled and are seen as simply sexual behavior and not a specific identity or as sinful behavior or grounds for physical violence. There's just a difference in definition. Okay, looking at immigration as another intersection. So when it comes to gender roles and marital arrangements, this might have to change really for immigrants when they decide to come to, the United States. So the changes can be positive or negative. So sometimes this could be downward mobility, meaning a decline in income, social class, and status that can result from immigration, right? Like how many people have you heard of that they were a doctor or an engineer somewhere and now they work retail here, right? That they, as much as this is supposed to be the land of opportunity, right? We'll talk later about the kind of globalization and the structure of the economy, how, the opportunity is just not the same as it used to be, right? And so in a lot of ways, our gender roles, the way that we expect to date and marry, these things are very culturally specific, right? And so sometimes to be able to kind of fit into a new cultural dynamic, some of those things change, or at least if they don't change immediately, they change generationally. And of course, this also connects to sexualities, as there's cultural rules about how to do, not just gender, but how to do sexuality. From country to country, these things differ. So immigration takes a toll on families, and it can really affect individuals in many ways. And one of those ways is to change their status locations in society. So when you migrate and you're a sexual minority, moving from one country to another, you can encounter new cultural rules and expectations about how to perform your gender and how to perform, sexuality or what's expected for sexuality. So xenophobia is institutional and individual bias against people that are seen as foreign. When people move from one country to another, the gender strategies they employ in their new home country might be impossible than the ones that they would have done at home. So sometimes our social definitions are just very different, where sometimes it's more desirable to employ certain new strategies in your new location. When it comes to migration and marriage, married couples may migrate together or one at a time. So one partner will go to another country and then kind of build a life there, send remittance payments, and, financially secure the opportunity to bring their family. So when migrating separately, a couple's division of labor may collapse. If there's a very strict gendered division of you cook, you clean, you work for money, those things can collapse when you're by yourself, because then you have to take on new roles, right? And unexpectedly, those definitions shift. So couples that migrate together might also find themselves in new roles, but this can come from new opportunities or new economic realities that they're living in. So I included this video, but I'm not going to watch it right here just because sometimes I get flagged for copyright stuff if I do that. So anyway, you can watch this. It's in the link that you have on Canvas. But, this is a little quick video about the SayHerName movement that started because police violence against Black women was underreported in the media. So it was launched in December of 2014 by the African American Policy Forum and Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies. The SayHerName campaign brings awareness of the often invisible names and stories of Black women and girls who've been victimized by racist police violence. And they also provide support for the families. So Black women and girls as young as 7 years old and as old as 93 years old have been killed by police, though we rarely hear their names. To lift up their stories and illuminate police violence against Black women, we need to know who they are, how they lived, and why they suffered at the hands of police. So, for example, Black women are killed by police even in the presence of their children. There's, this woman, Corinne Gaines, who was killed in her home with her 5-year-old son in her arms. The police had arrived at her home when a failure to appear warrant from a traffic violation got their attention. Or you have Atiana Jefferson, who was killed in her home while playing video games with her 8-year-old nephew. And the police entered her property concealed and unannounced. And it was all because her neighbor called in a wellness check because he saw her front door was open at like midnight. And the reason for that was it was hot. It was a hot night. And she had the door open. She was playing with her, it was a weekend. She was playing video games with her nephew. And so they didn't announce themselves. And within seconds, they shot her through the window from the outside, killing her in her own home next to her 8-year-old nephew. So Black women are killed by police even when they're not the main targets, right? You have Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old emergency medical technician who was killed by police when they mistakenly entered her home in the middle of the night on a no-knock warrant while searching for a suspect that had already been detained. It was like an ex of hers that she didn't have a relationship with for a long period of time, and they shot and killed her in her own home. You have India Kager, who was a post office worker and Navy veteran who was killed by police with her 4-month-old child in the back seat. So her and her boyfriend Angelo were killed, and somehow baby Roman survived, but of course without his parents. So these are just a couple women's stories, just 4 women's stories out of many, many stories. And again, the media doesn't pay attention, and so as a result, we don't know their stories in the same way that we know about, Eric Gardner or George Floyd. And so, a lot of these other killings have received a lot more media attention and as a result have spurned on rights movements. But for a lot of these women's stories, they still kind of go underreported. Okay, so looking at disability and masculinity, physical disability can change the way we do gender. And really the way that other people perceive us. Specifically when it comes to disability and men, it affects the way that people perceive them sexually. So disability and masculinity are connected because with men, being disabled, it affects how they're stereotyped, right? So when it comes to social class, this is also another factor, as many who are disabled live in poverty due to the ableist society that ignores their social opportunities. And of course, the kind of weird way that our disability system is insane. Like you can't get married and even have your coverage. So, that's a whole nother thing for another lecture. But anyway, new gender strategies as a result are employed to counter stereotypes. So one example given in the book is murder ball, which is basically wheelchair rugby that allows disabled men to reclaim their masculinity by proving that they're just as assertive and aggressive and competitive as they were before their injury. The Paralympics are another example, that people can be more athletic even though they're grappling with the loss of a limb, but they're still a champion, right? So in addition to contending with ableism, Disabled men and women also face specific challenges when attempting to do gender. So when it comes to women, for men, disability means that their ability to be assertive with their bodies and masculinity are questioned. But for women, their attractiveness and sexuality are what is affected. So disability requires women to enact new or different gender strategies. So disability interacts with masculinity and femininity, as well as class, race, ethnicity, and other things about us, making life with a disability different for men and women. Of course, age is another important intersection. The view of attractiveness is different for older women than older men, and the effectiveness of gender strategies differ. So ageism is just prejudice based on a preference for youth, where aging is equated with mental deficiency and reduced social value. So we have very youthful beauty standards in our culture. Youthful beauty is, the standard by which all women are judged. While men can become a silver fox or a distinguished gentleman, a good breadwinner, or a sugar daddy. Again, notice how all of those have an emphasis on financial success. Women can only become a cougar or a granny as they age. So if we live long enough, we will all grow old. That's how it works. And aging will affect not only our appearance and use of our body, but how others perceive our bodies and how they perceive our value. So aging takes a toll on your body, on your self-image, but it also affects other things like your job options, your relationship options, your finances, and your identity. These changes are not the same for everyone because aging can be harder for those in more marginal situations. So for example, for those in the working class. So working class women on average lose their looks sooner than middle and upper class women, even though losing their looks carries greater cost. So age is what sociologists call a social identity, which is culturally available and socially constructed category of people to which you or others belong. So in our culture, if we only value women as beautiful and young, once they don't look beautiful and young, they're not valued anymore. So I have some examples of women on here that are not young, but they are beautiful, right? But what is something all these women share? They're incredibly rich. And being incredibly rich means having all the good serums and all the skin creams and all the things, and also the rest, the hair, the makeup people, all of the things that people in the working class don't have, like teeth, right? Or things that again, rich people take for granted because they have access to a doctor. They have access to like skincare regimens and dermatologists and all sorts of other things that can keep them looking impossibly young. So they can still try to have relevance within their career field because again, as women age, they're marginalized and pushed to the side within the film industry. So it's interesting how, again, just another example of how sometimes it's not just gender and age, it's gender, age, and social class, right? And we can keep intersecting and adding more and more intersections and looking at the specific ways in which the social definition of each social identity affects the definitions of the others. So it shows that they're all intricately linked. Like this, I don't know why this always reminds me of when I was doing research on the 2008 election. And the thing that stood out to me the most was how the media representation was like, which one's worse? Racism or sexism? And you're like, both. They're both terrible, but they're both intricately connected. You can't get rid of one without the other because their meanings inform each other, right? So I feel like that's always a good example to kind of reiterate some of the points that the chapter's making about just the importance of understanding and really having an intersectional lens by which you view social inequality in the world, because otherwise you're never going to understand the full dimensions of what's happening or what's at play in our society.